The rifle bag landed wrong. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Corporal Tessa Vane. Not her scores, not her record, not the fact that she'd placed in the top 2% of her sniper qualification course out of Fort Bragg. What they noticed was that her rifle bag hit the floor of the equipment cage at Lancer Company's forward staging area with a sound that was, in Staff Sergeant Rourke's words, like a goddamn toy landing in a toy chest. He said it loud enough for the whole bay to hear. He said it because he wanted the whole bay to hear. Vane picked up the bag without looking at him. She set it on the rack, unzipped it with the kind of deliberate calm that came not from peace but from practice, and began her pre-check. Bolt, chamber, scope mounts. The men in the bay went back to what they were doing, which was mostly watching her while pretending not to. There were 9 of them assigned to the forward element at FOB Calloway, tucked into a stretch of southeastern Afghanistan where the elevation made everything harder. Breathing, shooting, carrying the weight that kept you alive. The unit had been running cross-attached with a Ranger element for 3 weeks when Vane arrived. She was a replacement. The original spotter, a specialist named Oakes, had taken shrapnel to the knee during a vehicle breach 4 days earlier and was already stateside. Vane had been pulled from the 75th Support Battalion and pushed forward on 12 hours' notice. Nobody asked for her. That was important. It mattered. The way these things always matter in small units where trust is a currency and strangers spend too much of it too fast. Sergeant First Class Braddock ran the element. He was 41 years old, had been in for 22 years, and communicated primarily through silence and variations of silence. The kind that meant yes, the kind that meant absolutely not, the kind that meant he was thinking and you should stop talking. He watched Vane complete her pre-check from across the bay and said nothing. That was its own kind of verdict. Rourke was the one who talked. He was 28, a squad leader with 2 combat deployments, and a reputation for being good under fire and difficult everywhere else. He had the easy confidence of someone who had been right often enough to stop questioning whether he was right. He leaned against the rack next to Vane's and watched her work. "What'd you qualify on?" he asked. "M110, Vane said. Rourke looked at the bag. "That a SAS?" "Modified." He made a sound. Not quite a laugh, more like the noise a person makes when they're deciding whether something is funny. "We've been running the SR-25 out here, different feel." "I know. You shot one before?" She looked at him for the first time. She had brown eyes and a very still face. "Yes." Rourke nodded like he was storing this information in a folder labeled unlikely. He pushed off the rack and walked away, and the conversation was over. And that was how it started. The thing about Vane that nobody knew yet, because nobody had asked, and because she wasn't the kind of person who volunteered information about herself, was that her father had been a competitive long-range shooter for 30 years. Not military, civilian. He shot at ranges in rural Pennsylvania, where the targets were set at 800, 1,000, 1,200 yards, and the men who gathered on weekends to do this were the kind of men who built their own rifles and loaded their own ammunition, and argued about ballistic coefficients the way other people argued about football. Vane had grown up on those ranges. She had her first cartridge pressed into her hand at age 7 by a father who believed in starting early and explaining everything. He never told her she was good because she was his daughter. He told her she was good when she was good, and he told her when she wasn't and why, and by the time she was 14, she was beating grown men at distances they'd been shooting for decades. Her father died the year she turned 19. Heart attack in the driveway before the ambulance got there. She joined the Army 6 months later. Her recruiter had asked her why, and she had said she wanted structure, which was true, and she had not said that she also wanted somewhere her body could be useful in ways that grief was not, which was more true. She never talked about any of this. It wasn't relevant to anything at FOB Calloway, and it wouldn't have mattered if it were. You don't explain yourself to people who've already decided what you are. The first joint mission was a route reconnaissance. 12 kilometers of mountain road, 2 vehicles, and a fire support position on a ridgeline that gave the team overwatch on 3 separate choke points. Vane was assigned the overwatch position with Braddock. Rourke led the vehicle element with Corporal Dern and 2 others. They moved out at 04:30. The temperature had dropped overnight into the low 30s, and the wind was coming off the ridge in gusts that varied between 12 and 22 miles per hour, the kind of variation that made precision work feel like gambling. Vane noted it without commenting. She built the wind into her mental model as they climbed, revised it when the ridge changed the pattern. Revised it again when they settled into position and she could feel what the air was actually doing against her face. Braddock sat up beside her and said nothing. He had a spotting scope. He knew his job. What he didn't know yet was whether she knew hers. They lay on the cold ground for 40 minutes before anything moved. When something did move, a vehicle. Two men dismounting at the northern choke point. The particular way they looked back up the road before they looked forward. Vane had already slowed her breathing. She had already done the math on the distance, 860 yards, already accounted for the cold air's effect on bullet velocity, already made the minor adjustments that aren't in any manual, but are learned by people who have done this long enough that the rifle stops being a machine and starts being an extension of a decision. Braddock confirmed the target. Cleared to engage. She put the first round exactly where she'd said she would. The second man moved and she tracked him without rushing, without the small flinch that comes from emotion, and put the second round 6 inches higher to account for his movement. Both down. Braddock was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the same tone he would have used to report weather, "Good shooting." He didn't say it to her specifically. He said it to the air in front of him, like a man noting something in a log. But she heard it, and she understood what it cost him to say it about someone he hadn't decided to trust yet. When they came back in, Rourke was cleaning his weapon in the bay. He looked up when Vane came through the door. He looked at Braddock. Something passed between them that Vane wasn't meant to see and understood anyway. The small recalibration, the reluctant updating of an assessment that had already been filed. Rourke went back to cleaning his weapon. He didn't say anything. That was almost respect, but almost isn't. The following week, the element got a new attachment, a Special Forces warrant officer named Drayton, passing through on a liaison rotation, full of opinions about how the Ranger element was running their Overwatch protocols. He was the kind of person who made his assessments out loud and expected them to be received as gifts. He walked into the bay, saw Vane, and stopped. "Who's your sniper?" he asked Rourke. Rourke gestured. Drayton looked at Vane for a long moment, the way people look at things that don't match their expectations. "Huh," Drayton said. She qualified, Rourke said, which was, in its way, generous, more than he'd said to her face in 2 weeks. Drayton smiled the smile of someone who thinks they're being polite. "No question. Just command's got a school coming up. Intensive CQB integration, 2 weeks. Usually pull from the senior shooters. You planning to send her?" "She's my only sniper right now." Right, Drayton nodded. "Still, might want to think about who's on your trigger for the coast mission. Elevated profile, you know? Leadership's going to be watching." He said it like advice. It wasn't advice. Vane was at her rack when he said it. She didn't look up. She had learned, growing up on those ranges, that the men who questioned her before she shot never questioned her after. And the men who questioned her after, well, there weren't many of those. But this was different from a range. On a range, you shoot and then you're done, and your score is on the paper, and the paper doesn't argue. In a unit, the score doesn't matter as much as the room, and the room had decided something about her that the paper hadn't changed yet. That night, she wrote a letter to her father. She did this sometimes, not to send, obviously, because you can't send letters to the dead, but because she had grown up hearing his voice and she still heard it sometimes. And writing to him was the closest thing she had to talking to him. She didn't write about the mission. She wrote about the wind on the ridge, how it shifted at the peak in a way she hadn't expected and had to correct for mid-breath, and how there was a moment between the decision and the trigger where the whole world went quiet and everything was only geometry. "I think you would have liked it up there," she wrote. Cold, though. She folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket and went to sleep. The coast mission was scheduled for 17 days out. In those 17 days, 3 things happened. The first was a training rotation in which the element ran simulated direct action drills, and Drayton, who had extended his liaison attachment, watched from the perimeter and made notes. He kept looking at Vane. She kept not looking at him. The second was a conversation between Rourke and Braddock that she wasn't in, but heard through a wall that was thinner than anyone had accounted for. "Drayton's going to flag the composition report," Rourke said. "Let him flag it," Braddock said. "If command pulls her before coast, command pulls who I tell them to pull," Braddock said, "and I haven't told them anything yet." A pause. Then Rourke said, lower, So you know she can handle it." "Yeah." Another pause, longer. "That's not what I'm deciding." Vane stood on the other side of the wall and understood what he was deciding. He was deciding whether he could trust her with his people. Whether a score on a range, even repeated scores, even Braddock's own witnessed experience, was enough to stake Rourke and Dern and the others on. This was a reasonable thing to decide carefully. She knew that. She didn't blame him for it. She also knew she was going to have to earn it in a way that left no room for doubt, and that the earning would have to happen in a situation that didn't allow for the kind of deliberate setup she had on the ridgeline. It would have to happen fast, in conditions that weren't ideal, in front of people who were looking for reasons to revise their revision back. The third thing that happened was that Rourke, for the first time, asked her a real question. It was evening, the bay quiet, most of the element at chow. He sat down across from her with his coffee and looked at her for a moment, and then said, "Where'd you learn to shoot?" She told him about the ranges in Pennsylvania, about her father. She kept it brief, the essential facts, the geometry of it, not the grief. But she told him about the wind adjustments she'd learned by feel rather than formula, about the way her father had made her shoot until she was too tired to compensate for anything consciously, until the compensation was so deep in her muscle and her instinct that it happened before the thought did. Rourke listened. He had a way of being still when he was actually paying attention. "Your father serve?" he asked. "No, but he taught you." "Everything I know," Vane said, "and then I taught myself the rest." Rourke turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He's still around?" "No, sorry. It was a while ago." He nodded. He didn't ask what happened, which was the right call. What'd he shoot? Mostly he built custom rigs around the Remington 700 action. He had a 338 Lapua that he built from the ground up over 3 years. Never bought a component he could make himself. Rourke was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather did gunsmithing. In Georgia, shop out of his garage." He said it the way people say things they don't usually say. "Did you shoot with him some? Not like that?" He looked at his coffee. "I was better at talking than listening until about deployment 2. Took me a while." It was as close to an apology as he was capable of, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Coast was a hostage rescue operation that had been building for 6 weeks before the element got the tasking. A local interpreter who had worked with American forces had been taken by a regional network, small, adaptive, organized enough to move their captive twice in the first 4 days. By the time the tasking came down to Lancer element, the location was fixed. A compound on the eastern outskirts of a village, 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, guarded by a rotating element of 8 to 12 armed personnel. Vane's position was a rooftop 340 yards north of the compound's main gate. She had a partner, Dern, who had been trained as a secondary shooter but was running spotter on this. The assault element would breach the eastern wall simultaneously with her first shot, which was timed to create the maximum displacement of attention from the breach point. The briefing was in the operations center, 12 people around a table, maps and imagery spread across 3 monitors. Drayton was there as an observer. He sat at the end of the table and watched the brief like he was grading it. When the fire support portion came up, Vane's portion, he raised his hand. "What's the contingency if your sniper position goes hot before breach?" Braddock answered. "She holds and adjusts, and if she takes fire, she holds and adjusts," Braddock said again, in exactly the same tone. Drayton looked at Vane. "You comfortable with that?" The room went quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that is itself a question, whether she would fold under it, whether she would get defensive, whether she would say something that confirmed what he already believed. Vane looked at him steadily. "Yes, because if the position's compromised, I said yes," she said, not louder, not harder, just final. Drayton looked at Braddock. Braddock didn't look back at him. He was already moving to the next portion of the brief. The night of the operation, the temperature was 38 degrees and falling. The village was dark, except for a generator light in the compound's central building. Vane and Dern moved to their position without light, by feel and memory, and the low starlight that gave shape without detail. They were in position 42 minutes before the assault window. She lay still and let her eyes adjust. Dern settled beside her with the spotting scope, and they ran through their confirmation checks in whispers that were barely whispers, more like breath given shape. The compound's guards rotated on a pattern that was consistent enough to work with. The man on the north wall came around every 11 minutes. The one at the gate held position for most of the rotation and then moved 15 feet south around the 8-minute mark for reasons that seemed to involve a phone or a radio. The intelligence summary hadn't been specific. There was a third man on the roof of the eastern building who moved less predictably. She cataloged all of this without urgency. This was the part of the job that felt most like her father's ranges. The long wait, the stillness, the patient narrowing of the world to what was in front of you and what you were about to do. She had spent years learning to inhabit that stillness without being consumed by it, to stay sharp inside the quiet instead of sliding into a blankness that left you slow when the moment came. The assault element's signal came at 0217. Vane put the first round through the guard at the gate at 0213. She was already tracking the man on the north wall by the time the sound finished. He was moving, running toward the gate, which was the direction she had predicted, and she put the second round through him at 0217. 4 seconds, the assault element was through the eastern wall. What she didn't expect was the third man, the one on the roof, who came off the eastern building's ladder faster than the intelligence summary's unpredictable pattern had suggested. He wasn't running toward the gate. He was running to the north wall, toward the compound's exterior blind spot, toward the angle that would give him a line of sight on the breach team as they came through. Dern saw him, called the range and the bearing. There was a 3-second window, less, probably, and the geometry was not clean. The assault team was moving in her field of fire. The target was moving. The wind had shifted 3 degrees in the last 40 minutes, and she had made the correction mentally but not confirmed it against any fixed reference point. 3 seconds. She made the correction. She put the round exactly where it needed to go. The assault element reached the central building. 8 minutes later, they had the interpreter out. No American casualties. The element extracted clean. She didn't hear what Braddock said to the operational summary team. She heard about it later from Dern, who had been in the room, who told her in the parking bay while they were breaking down their equipment. He said you read the third man before the call, Dern said. Vane looked up from the scope she was cleaning. What? Said you were already tracking him when I spotted him, that you called the correction before he confirmed the range. She went back to the scope. I'd been watching him move for 40 minutes. Dern was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Well, Braddock included that in the debrief. He paused. In front of Drayton. She didn't respond to that. But she didn't need to. The formal assessment came 2 days later. It was a standard post-operation review. Metrics, timings, decision logs. Braddock read it to the element without commentary, which was his version of maximum praise. And when he got to the fire support section, he read the phrase precise and decisive under degraded conditions the same way he would have read a weather report. And everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. Rourke caught up with her outside afterward. He walked beside her for half a block without saying anything, which was unusual for him. Rourke without words was a different thing than Braddock without words. With Braddock, silence was a natural habitat. With Rourke, it meant something was being disassembled. You knew, he said finally, about the third guy. I had a read, she said. It wasn't certain. I had to. He nodded. They walked a little further. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of high-altitude clarity that makes everything look sharp and close. My grandfather, Rourke said, used to say the best shooters he ever saw weren't the ones who thought the least. They were the ones who did all their thinking before, so that when it counted, there was nothing left but the shot. Vane thought about her father on those Pennsylvania ranges, making her shoot until she was too tired to think, until the thinking had all been done in advance and only the body remained. He sounds like he knew what he was talking about. He did. Rourke was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I didn't listen better. Early. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the compound wall across the road. I know, she said. He nodded. That was enough for both of them. Drayton left on a Thursday. He did not say goodbye to Vane specifically, though he said goodbye to Braddock and to Rourke and to most of the others. She noticed this the way you notice weather. Something that is simply a condition of the environment, neither surprising nor particularly wounding. She had known men like Drayton her whole life. They were a feature, not an anomaly. You couldn't spend your energy on them. The targets didn't care. That evening she wrote another letter to her father. She told him about the compound, about the third man and the 3-second window and the wind correction. She hadn't been able to confirm against a fixed point. She told him about the way the world goes quiet, when everything has been prepared, when the thinking is done, and the body knows what to do, and there is only the breath and the geometry and the moment between the decision and the result. She told him that Rourke had apologized in the way that men like Rourke apologized, which was sideways and with someone else's words and meant completely. I think you'd like it here, she wrote. Cold, still. The elevation does something to the light. She paused, and then she wrote one more thing. I am doing the work. I am doing it well. You taught me how to do it, and I am doing it in every condition, and I am not letting the wind or the waiting or the men who don't believe me yet change what I know how to do. I miss you. I'm okay. She folded the paper and slid it into the inside pocket of her jacket, next to the other one. The pocket was getting thick. She would have to find a better place to keep them soon. Outside the bay, the wind was picking up again off the ridge, the same unpredictable gusts that never quite settled into a pattern you could predict. She noted it before she went to sleep. How it shifted at the peak, how it came off the eastern face harder than the western, how if she were lying on that ridge again tomorrow, she would account for it differently than she had the first time. You were always learning the wind. That was the thing. You never learned it once and had it. Every new ridge, every new elevation, every new morning with a different temperature and a different pressure and a different set of variables that you could not predict and had to read in real time with everything on the line. Her father had told her that when she was 12 years old. She had not fully understood it then. She had shot 10,000 rounds since, and she understood it more each time, and she suspected she would be understanding it for the rest of her life. She closed her eyes. The wind moved outside. Somewhere on the compound perimeter, boots crossed gravel. In the inside pocket of her jacket, folded in quarters, her letters waited. She was here. She was still here.